Widowed rancher searched for milk for his newborn, until the local girl knocked on a full breast. Zard halen a surf baraf, nahin, uthai. Usna ayet kushbu bilea yi jo Samuel Holt ne Eliza ki mot kebad kabi mesus naki, garam, mithi, du jaisi. Shayad ye buk kidokabazi ho. Lekin rose ne uski kamiz pakriar chupchaprut ge jais ha wa use bularahi ho. Chulai kia krilo thar karti bush rahithi. Darwaze par uska wohi notes the jodin mi usne kilise tokada, meri bachi ke liye du chahiye. Meharbani karo. Ar rat bar use kisine firi nahin. Du gante guzare, fidag nei awazayi, barf mi peyran ki sarsarahat. Sidi ustelistak. She par barf ki lekirin. Me aik sea kaim hua na ganti, napukar surf teen bar dima sadastak. Isidar hi hui jaisa koi fesla ho chuka ho, Samuel na rosko sina se chipkaya. Dud ki kushbu abhawami safti jaisa kisine abi kapron pargireya ho. Usnikil ki upar uthay bahar aik joan larki karithi gale thande, ankun me thakan, or uske shol keni che. Uska sans tez kuchaisa wada karta jo usne kabi sochabi nahinta. Darwaza hula, larkine basit nakaha. Main derse itu maaf karna. Mujhe malum hogeyata. Fit usne shol ko zara sambala. Or jo cheese usne samne raki usne Samuel ki zindagi ka ruk badal dia. Age jo hua, ab ko hila dega. Samuel Holt ne jab kaber parmiti ka akri chanta marata. Tuhawane uskekan me aikajib wada funka subatak tumhen rasta milega subatakushna mila nadud na madad bas barf ki paratar rose ki kamzor sanson kahisab teen dinon mi usne charga ribon ke darwaze katkateye jawab mi darar bari nazrain ya chipta hua afsu aishrat usne aiknei cheese koshishki Usne Eliza kanila shal kitki meloni kitara latkadia. Tufan mi bethte, logon kelie eknishan, or niche no to chipkadia, bachi bukihai. Jo sake madad kare. Ratgeri to kitki parbar fulon kitara jamgei. Achanak shal kihaj kisi uthi jaisa kisine use endhare se pakraho. Firshi she par kisi ungline hawa mi alfaz leke jo foran mitageye. Dastak nahin, surf ik lamha barka saya or fidarwaze ke niche se garam bukar jaisi mehakrangi hui hawa. Busi. Samuel na kundi gumadi, delis par ik larki karithi bigi sans me or rose ne peli dafa sida. Uski taraf hat badaya. Larkine nazar uthakarkaha, main uski roti ho sakti hun. Agar tum himmat rak sakti ho. Jobat usne agle jumle miki wushihar bar ki kamoshiko fadegi. Barf se daka Dry Willow sota padata. Jab Samuel nebara se purana board nikala ar usparko. Leise lik dia. Milkor mercy. Usne board koraste ke kona parga dia. Ar wapis akar roan gode ko hol dia ke. Agar koi rasi keinche tu sunsak. Rat barf ne zamin ko gumkar dia. Surf ganti ki halka si janjan, or bachi ki wazan sebi halki chik. Subatak board pe kisine shota sa nishan choda. Ekeli ungli ka daira. Beach me ik katra jo jam ke moti bange. Samuel ne ise endesha samja. Magar jaise hi wapasaya. Uske darwaze se kagas ki halki si harash. Sunaidi zamin par ik parchi fisli. Aishrat jab hawa tamjeye. Kitki par nila rangrenedena. Hu nila shal usne wahan hilatka dia. Adarat guzri. Hawa ek dam chu. Firsidi mapi hui dastak nates. Nakam jaisa koi hatkan ho. She ke ispar ik larki katura jispar na sharm. Nadaro surf ik fezla. Usne bilku chuprethte. Hu shal ko halke se kinarakia. Arjo usne samne raka usmi bachi ki zindagi kapela. Asasa, agla lamha puri kahaniko badal dega.
Samuel Holt woke to Rose's thin whimper and the scrape of wind along the eaves.
a sound like bone on stone. He swung his legs from the narrow bed, found the floor colder than memory, and lifted the child, feeling how light she had become. Her mouth searched the blanket, rooting for a promise he could not keep. He warmed a dented cup of goat's milk by the coals, rubbed the nipple with lard, and tried again. Rose turned away, cheeks hollowed, eyelids fluttering with effort, and the little sound she made frayed into silence. He let a drop wet her lip. She grimaced, coughed, and sagged. He held her until his hands began to shake. Snow ticked at the panes. Outside, Dry Willow waited under an iron sky, cottonwoods bare, the creek a dark thread. He pulled on cracked boots, wrapped Rose in his coat, and stepped into air that burned his teeth. By daylight he would beg again. The roan tossed in the lean-to. He settled Rose in the sling, swung up, and rode for the nearest lights. The first homestead crouched under a cutbank. He called and lifted a hand. Merritt, a haying partner in better seasons, cracked the door with a child on his hip. Samuel asked for milk, for help for a nursing woman if one could be found. Sorry for your loss, Merritt said, eyes on the sky. He shook his head. We've none to spare. The door clicked shut like a ledger entry. At the Haynes place, a girl with flour to her wrists, opened a finger's width and said her mother had the fever. She looked at Rose as if memorizing a face she feared to see again, whispered, God help you, and pushed the latch. He rode to Batty Creek, where the Soddy sank into the bank. The couple there had lost a calf, and would not risk more charity. At the shepherd's camp, a Basque herder warmed his hands over a dung fire, offered whiskey and pointed him toward town. He rode until the roan blew white steam and the infant slept too quietly. By noon he stood in the mercantile doorway, with Rose tight to his ribs, while ice slid from his hat brim. He asked the clerk to spread the word that milk was needed for a baby. The man nodded, and wrote two names already crossed off in Samuel's memory. Outside, the road glazed to glass. He rode home with a sack of cornmeal he could not afford, and a hope as thin as thread. The ranch met him with the lean shrug it had offered since autumn. The north fence slumped, wire coiled in weeds like rusted snakes. Inside, breath smoked, and the old goat watched with the flat mercy of beasts. Samuel milked her into a blackened pail. The stream came bitter and thin. He warmed it, tested his wrist, and tried again. Rose swallowed once, grimaced, and wept without sound. Anger rose at the cup, at the goat, at himself for imagining a kinder world. He laid Rose in the cradle, and set his palms on the table to steady himself. The cabin smelled of damp ash, raw wool and old pine. Eliza's shawl kept its place, a soft blue witness. He tried to tidy what had gathered since, but each object had its own gravity. The basin, the sewing kit, the folded linen that would never be used. He fed the last cedar slats to the stove, and watched the light steady. In it, the midwife's sleeves were rolled, and the lamp made a ragged crown on the rafters. Eliza's breath came shallow. Samuel wiped her brow, though the basin had iced. The midwife murmured, tightened the knot, and set her hands in a way that said the work had run beyond skill. Eliza's fingers weakened in his. Her smile found him once more, small and fierce, and then the room stilled. The midwife bowed her head. Rose wailed, bright with first air, and he became two people, the one who reached, and the one who watched himself fail to hold them both. He came back with a shiver, and found he had been standing without moving. Wind creaked the chinking. He wrapped Rose tighter, counted heartbeats against his chest, and decided he would ask again, even if he had to wear out every path in the valley. He rode after dark to the Dalton spread, where a new milk cow had been the week's talk. The foreman met him at the yard pump. Samuel asked. The man said the boss did not like his people tied in another man's trouble with calves. Do. My girl is starving, Samuel said. The foreman looked past him and managed. I'm sorry, like a man returning a hat after a funeral. He rode home with frost threading his collar, and a question beating in his skull. How long could a child dwell at the edge without falling through? The stars burned with an indifferent clarity. At the gate he dismounted into drift that reached his shins. He set Rose near the stove and found a scrap of planed pine in the wood box. He printed in coal strokes, so even a hurried traveler would read, "Milk needed for my baby, please help." He fixed the board on the road. On the way back he tore a page from an account book, wrote the plea again, and pinned it to the doorframe with a bent tack. Inside, the fire thinned toward ash. He brewed coffee so weak it showed the cup's bottom, and let it go cold. He warmed stones and folded them into a towel for the cradle. He told Rose the names of flowers she might see in June if luck shifted. He told her about the fall dew, and the creek when it ran loudly in the thaw. He told her none of it mattered unless she stayed. She answered with a sigh that barely lifted her chest. Night set. The roan pawed in the lean-to. Samuel set his hand on the bar and listened to the house breathe. In that listening, he heard another sound, a tread counting itself over crusted snow, not the slough of drifts, but a person walking with purpose and care. He reached toward the shotgun and stopped. The steps halted on the porch. For a long beat there was nothing, and then a knock, 3 measured taps that settled in his ribs like a held note. He looked to Rose, whose eyes were open and dull with thirst. He lifted her, set her in the crook of his arm, and opened the door. Wind pressed close, but the lantern's throw made a small island of light. A young woman stood in it. Her dress clung to her wet. A dark shawl pinned at her throat trembled. Snow glazed her lashes. Her breathing came fast from miles in bad weather. Her eyes went to Rose and softened with a pain he recognized. "I'm Clara," she said, raw and quiet. "From the swale place beyond the cotton woods. I saw your note," she whispered, teeth chattering. "If you'll allow it I can nurse her." Samuel stepped aside and let Clara pass, then pushed the door until the latch ceded and the wind thinned to a hiss along the chinks. Lantern light glazed the damp on her shawl and lifted a modest warmth from the stove. She did not speak at first. She only looked at Rose with a tenderness that carried knowledge. The kind no stranger should possess and yet must when a baby's breath has grown threadbare. Samuel's arms felt wooden from hold. He surrendered the child into Clara's grasp and felt fear change shape inside his chest. Not gone, only altered by the sight of competent hands. Clara stood near the fire, unpinned the shawl with stiff fingers, and pressed her sleeve to her mouth as if steadying herself against a rush of feeling. Then she sat, loosened the damp bodice, and guided Rose with a practiced touch that could not have vanished when sorrow came. The infant latched, clumsy at first. Then sure. A soft click sounded. Then another, and a rhythm began that matched the slow draw of the stove. Samuel turned away and braced his hands on the table because relief hurt. Milk, breath, swallow, pause. Rose's small hands flexed against Clara's dress, opening and closing like pale stars. Color rose to the child's cheeks and chased the gray hollows from her mouth. Clara let her eyes fall shut and breathed out a long ribbon of air. In that breath Samuel heard the echo of another room, another woman, another time. He watched the lantern's halo ride the plank seam, counted the nail heads, and forced his jaw to unlock. Clara began to hum, a low, almost private sound with no tune he could name. Only a healing rise and fall that met the pulls at her breast. Damp wisps escaped at her temples and curled in the heat. The wind pawed the rafters and gave up. Rose's swallow slowed, then found steadiness. Samuel dragged a hand across his face, and saw Liza's shawl where it hung, blue as thaw water, neat on the chair because he had not yet ruined the one thing she left orderly. He almost spoke her name, but syllables crowded at the back of his throat and refused to come. He lit the kettle and poured water into a cup painted with forget-me-nots. Then set it within Clara's reach without meeting her eyes. Steam rose and veiled her a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, that rush of air again steadier now. He nodded. The simple sound placed something back inside the walls, a domestic chord he had not heard since the day winter took hold, and refused to unclench. The room reduced itself to essentials. Fire, milk, the infant's jaw working, Clara's humming thread, Samuel's uneven breath. The goat shifted in the lean-to, and the harness creaked once. Ash settled with a faint sigh. He kept his gaze on the stove door because the sight before him felt holy, and looking directly might turn it brittle. Still he watched in the metal's reflection the slow arch of Clara's shoulders and the baby's cheek rounding with each swallow. Clara spoke without lifting her head. "My boy lived 9 days." The words were even, but they dragged grief like a sled across a stony yard. "He came early in February. Snow to the sill. I buried my husband in November. Fever." Her fingers traced small circles on Rose's back. Milk stayed. Though there was no mouth to take it, the body would not agree with loss. She drew another breath. "When I saw your note, It felt like a rope over a well. Her mouth tightened in something near a smile that hurt to see. Samuel gripped the table's edge. You came through the weather for us. For her, Clara said. And her eyes flicked toward Rose with a fierceness that startled him. The fierceness softened at once into quiet purpose. And for myself, she added. No apology in it. Only truth. A log settled and threw brief sparks against the iron. Rose released, sighed, then rooted again. Clara shifted and offered the other side. Movements modest, certain, not seeking shelter in words. The rhythm resumed. The hush inside the cabin changed quality. No longer an emptiness, but a fullness held like water in cupped hands. Samuel realized how long he had lived, braced for failure. Relief felt like a blow. He let his shoulders drop and his hands hang open. The knuckles were split, the palms scuffed, the lines blackened with stove soot and wire. He saw them and did not know them. He closed his eyes and stood in a hallway of memory. Eliza's head tilted against the pillow, the midwife's sleeve rolled, the lamp making a ragged crown on the rafters, the sound of the doctor's boots at the threshold, the way his wife smiled once, small and bright, as if handing him courage before turning away. He had known then that courage could not feed, mend, or stop blood. He knew it again now, and yet the small life at Clara's breast gained strength with every swallow. That knowing brought a pain that was not sharp, only large. Clara opened her eyes and looked at the shawl. Blue like creek water when the ice lets go, she said. He would have had a blanket that color. Her voice thinned, then steadied. I never got to show him the ridge. We will take her there when the thaw comes, Samuel said, surprising himself. He felt the truth of it and let it stand. They fell silent and allowed the small music in the room to lead. Rose nursed, drowsed, nursed again. The lantern ticked as heat licked the chimney. Outside, the sign on the door creaked against its bent tack and kept its vigil. Inside, meat and beans waited untouched because eating seemed profane, while milk answered hunger. Snow found its way through the cottonwoods and hissed along the eave. When Rose finally lost and drifted toward sleep, Clara lifted her to her shoulder and patted with a careful rhythm, until a polite burp rose. She smiled without showing teeth. Samuel turned, unable to keep distance any longer, and saw the child's mouth soften into a small pout that looked like peace. He knew he would remember that shape if he lived to plant apples by the gate. You can use the spare room, he said. The bed is plain, but warm if I heat a stone. He hesitated, thinking of talk that travels quicker than thaw. Then he set worry aside. Please stay. Roads will crust to glass by dawn. Clara looked at him as though measuring the safety of the word please. Then she nodded once. Only if it suits your house, she said. I can come morning and evening if you allow. She will gain if we keep a steady way. My milk will settle. Your hands can mend the fence and sleep for some hours. The word re-landed in him like a stake set true. He found breath and said, yeah. He carried the warmed stone wrapped in cloth to the small room and shook the blanket. Dust rose and fell. Have you ever felt a stranger's kindness change your life? Share your story below. Winter. After nursing, Clara pinned cloths on a line near the hearth and watched steam unlace into the air. On the fifth morning, the wind gave up its argument, and the cloud broke to rags. Samuel fetched a ladder, paused, and noticed paths beginning between door, pen, lean-to and pump prints pressed by care. Not only need, he carried the ladder inside, leaned over the hearth, and brushed soot from a stone that always shed grit into food. Hold that, he said. Clara set her palm to the rung, while he scraped the face smooth, and seated the block again with a gentle tap. The room brightened as if relieved. A thaw hour opened, and they rode to town for nails, thread, soap and salt pork. At the mercantile, voices wheeled like sparrows. Laughter snagged on a phrase that traveled then landed near the counter in a tone too mild to call itself unkind. Helping hands sure find easy roofs, a woman said while weighing beans. A man answered with amusement that chafed. Widow always did carry strong notion. The clerk pretended concern for his scale. Clara folded her list, tucked it away, and lifted her chin a hair. Samuel paid exact change and waited on the step until she stood beside him. We know what we are doing, he said. Not loud, not challenging, only setting a boundary. So does she. Clara murmured, looking at Rose bundled in his arms. The child blinked at the light and wrinkled her nose as if deciding to accept the day. Back home quietly recovered its citizenship. Samuel hung a blanket to blunt the draft near the door, and drove short nails into the seat of the chair. Clara used when the baby needed soothing. He sanded the edge, so cloth would not catch, rubbed tallow into the grain, and stepped away so she could sit without asking. She lowered herself with a tired wince she did not bother to hide. He pretended not to notice, then offered a cushion stuffed with clean wool. "For your back," he said. Acceptance looked like a nod and a softening at the corners of her eyes. Afternoons carried a stillness with weight. Knitting continued its soft argument with patience. Stitches climbed while Rose dozed in shifting squares of light. Sometimes Clara read the single book left on the shelf. An almanac with notes in Eliza's neat hand. She traced rows that described water and month. Samuel listened while repairing the harness, and his mouth would compress at a margin where Eliza had left a sum that never balanced. Work did not empty grief, yet it rounded the sharpest corners. Toward evening, he took down the fiddle that had slept behind rafters since autumn. He tried a phrase and quit, embarrassed by the way sound tore the air. Clara did not turn. She fed Rose and hummed until courage returned. Then he found a gentler path through a kitchen tune. The child approved by relaxing so completely that her hand opened like a blossom. When sleep came, Clara tucked her into the cradle, and settled a warmed stone near small feet, a modest safeguard that looked like competence made visible. Saturday brought more talk. Clara needed flour and needles. Samuel promised to wait while they chose carefully. Voices hushed when they stepped onto Main. Two ranch hands pretended interest in a wagon tongue, then sent remarks that used no names and reached all the same. Samuel kept walking. He bought a bolt of plain brown and after seeing Clara study a narrow band, added a ribbon the color of thaw water. The clerk's mouth twitched, then flattened when Samuel looked up. Snow retreated along the ditch margins. Water ran under lace and showed a black seam of current. Rose's cheeks rounded. Her cry filled the room with music that asserted life instead of pleading for it. At dawn Samuel left a covered bowl of stew near Clara's basket. She found it warm, smiled into the steam, and ate before the baby woke. At noon she reheated coffee and sweetened it for him when he came in from replacing a post he had thought would last until June. He grunted, surprised by the simple mercy of heat meeting cold fingers. Days gathered habits without fanfare. He checked latches, planed a sticking door, and set a peg for Clara's shawl so it would not fall. She turned the spare room tidy, folded linens to the same width and kept a tin of salve ready for split knuckles. They met in the middle, one carrying wood, one carrying the child, exchanging small looks that said the house was learning their name. When the wind returned, Samuel stapled canvas over the lean-to gap and checked the latch twice. Clara drew the cradle a hand's breadth from the wall, and slid a folded blanket under the mattress. Rose woke hungry, loud and on. Clara laughed under her breath when the child demanded an answer at once. Samuel, startled by the sound, recognized how long laughter had been missing. He smiled into the stove's dim window, and for a moment looked younger than the hard months would allow. On a gray afternoon the kettle whispered while Rose slept. Clara held the yarn but did not move the needles. Before fever took him, she said. Eli kept a thin journal of things worth fixing, nothing grand. Hinge pins, lamp wicks, ridge leaks. He liked how lists made a roof hole. Her mouth softened, then steadied. We planned to set a few trees by the swale once snow broke. He drew rows on paper and named each one. She looked toward the window where cottonwoods stood like ribs. He never saw spring. Samuel set his awl down. Eliza wanted apples by the gate, he said. Said a tree can be a promise a house keeps. He did not dress the words in anything finer. They rested in the air and did not sink. Clara's gaze went to the hearthstone he had seated. He would have set that right on the first day, she said. Pride meant for a man gone and perhaps shared with the one present. Evening gathered them near the fire with habits that made a nest without proclaiming it. She mended shirts with exact stitch. He rubbed oil into leather until it drank back color. Sometimes their hands touched when both reached for the same spoon or lifted the kettle together. Neither apologized. They let the contact register and pass. Outside, coyotes laced the hills with brief cries and longer quiet. Inside, the room kept the peace. As March pressed a shoulder against winter's door, mud took the road by day and froze it again at night. Gossip lost bite when calves began to drop, and hands needed wages more than store. Clara walked the yard with Rose on her hip and pointed out tracks pressed into thawing banks. Cat, rabbit, bird. Samuel fixed the south gate so it swung without screeching and watched as the child reached for sunlight wobbling across a puddle. That evening, while the wind combed the cottonwoods and stew sent up its honest scent, Clara set the needles aside. Eli courted me with a jar of early honey, she said, smiling in a way that did not bruise. He scraped it from a split log, hands sticky, said it proved he could sweeten a lean month. She looked at the sleeping child. I thought sweetness ended, then I heard your note snap on the door in that storm, and something inside me stepped forward without asking. Samuel listened and did not tidy her grief. He let silence be the bowl that held it while the fire stitched warmth across a room, learning how to rest. Morning thaw turned the ruts to glass, and with thaw came talk that ran ahead of wagons. At the mercantile, Clara felt it before a syllable formed. How greetings thinned, how eyes took quick inventory of her hands while sliding past rows. Samuel waited by the door, hat damp, shoulders squared. He paid for flour, needles, soap and salt, then stood aside so Clara could tie twine. The proprietor's wife smiled without warmth. Behind the counter, a scoop clinked against a bin. Clara thanked the man, tucked the parcels and steadied the baby's bonnet. Outside, wagon boards creaked, and a dog shook rein from its coat like someone refusing an argument. Two ranch hands leaned on a post, boots crossed, coats unbuttoned to prove bravado. One said, "Just loud enough." Holt found a neat cure for sorrow. The other answered. Dry Willow never lacked ingenuity. Their laughter ran short when the wind shifted. Samuel did not speak. He shifted Rose in the crook of his arm and passed Clara the bundle. Restraint rode his shoulders like thin armor. Clara kept her gaze level and walked past, refusing to flinch. By dusk, the sky pressed down. A lid set heavy on the valley. Wind found the north seam of the cabin, and worried it. Samuel fixed canvas over the lean-to gap, then came inside to see steam rising from a kettle. The first drops were large and widely spaced. Then rain gathered force, hammered shingles, rattled the patched window, and crept in a thin thread along the sill. Clara wedged a rag and set a bucket. Rose startled, then softened when a hummed note smoothed the air. Samuel wiped the seam, set a nail, and watched water turn from insistence to patience. They ate in a careful hush. Spoon met bowl, the kettle breathed, and wind answered questions nobody dared to ask. Clara wrapped yarn around her fingers, then unwrapped, as if order should be gentle. They think I welcome the role, she said finally. They think hunger makes a stage. Samuel set his palms flat, so his fists would reconsider. They think everything but truth, he answered, then softened it. They do not know this house. Lightning stitched the ridgeline and left the room blinking. The child sighed in her sleep, a sound more convincing than anything the storm said. The storm herded voices onto the porch, the same men from the post, seeking shelter where their comments had already lodged. Holt's place sings a cradle song, one said, leaning on irony. Another replied, names fade quickly when comfort fills a chair. Laughter tapped the door like a thrown seed. Samuel rose and reached for the latch. Clara shook her head. Let the weather do the speaking. He let his hand fall, though his jaw refused to soften. He set another stick on the fire and watched the flame steady as if rehearsing courage. Rain searched for every weakness. The patched pane thumped. The bucket filled in thin coin. The seam gave once and then held. Between gusts came talk from under the eaves, words oiled by liquor. Virtue wears a tidy dress tonight. Poor Eliza, someone added, using sorrow as garnish. Heat climbed Samuel's neck. He imagined stepping out, naming each man, carving consequence into memory. Instead he trimmed the wick and returned to his chair, because the child required heat, not spectacle. Maybe I should move back to the Swale place, Clara said, eyes on a dish she was drying. I could ride in mornings and evenings. Distance might quiet mouth. Samuel wanted to answer that distance seldom silences anything ravenous. He did not want to hand her a promise the valley could break. You stepped into hunger with full hands, he said. Judgment prefers empty room. She folded the cloth, set it down and nodded once. Not in agreement, more in acknowledgement that the world sometimes makes a poor judge. The next day the market simmered. Boys stacked feed, watched Clara, and tried on faces men had taught them. An older woman arranged jars and announced to the air, homes fall when gates stay open. The proprietor sold thread with a throat-clearing apology, wrapped in silence. Clara bought flour, ribbon and needles, then left with her chin level and her pace calm. Outside, Samuel lifted Rose higher, thanked Clara for the parcel, and kept to the ditch where mud ran thinner. He waited until the ranch sank into view before speaking. "It drags your name," Clara continued, voice steady from practice. "And hers. People take comfort when roles stay fit. They see me and think a seat has been stolen." Samuel watched the fence line lift from the snow like a suture. "Seats are chairs," he said. "Lives are rooms." She did not smile. The barn's shadow met them at the gate. The sign on the door still held, though the weather had chewed its corners. Inside, they laid supplies on the table. Clara checked Rose, then walked the room as if verifying the structure still recognized its purpose. Evening redrew the horizon. Wind bullied the cottonwoods and shook free a limb somewhere beyond the coop. Samuel propped the ridge beam on instinct, and listened for any crack that should alarm him. Voices returned, thinner through rain. At the far fence. "She plays house," one said. "A widow's milk is still milk," another replied with a laugh shaped for cruelty. Samuel memorized timber because timber reveals who will stand when called. He shut the door without opening it. Clara watched the gesture and looked away, as though the sight of restraint cut deeper than noise ever could. When the lantern sank to a ring of glow, Clara rose. "I will sleep in the spare room," she said. With the door shut, she did not look at Samuel when she said it, because courage sometimes requires a fixed point elsewhere. She lifted Rose, kissed her forehead, settled the blankets and held her palm to the tiny chest, until breath patterned under her hand. At the threshold, she paused, gathered her shawl and whispered, "Morning, I will see how the town feels. If it stays like this, I will ride from the swale and nurse by hours." Then she stepped inside and turned the key. Samuel sat with the fire ticking low, listening to rain try the latch again and again, patient as accusation. He thought of Eliza's shawl, of the note pinned to the door, of Clara walking up the path in the first storm without asking permission from anyone but conscience. Kindness carries a cost, and rumor collects daily. He banked the coals, set the bucket under the seam, and told the room what he could vow without falsehood. He would brace the window at dawn, replace the pane this week, and learn each voice at the fence well enough to choose the moment for reply. Behind the closed door, Clara lay awake, hearing rain name her aloud, tallying glances, weighing every kindness, asking whether staying answered duty or vanity, and whether leaving would save anyone from pain but herself. "Have you faced judgment for doing what's right? Tell us in the comments." Midnight ripped the ridge with a flat white flare, then left the valley to the hiss of ice on rain. In the spare room, Clara lay rigid under her shawl, listening to the house keep watch. She could not stop hearing the mercantile's tidy venom replacing easy roof. Poor Eliza. She tried counting the baby's breaths through the thin wall and failed. When Rose whimpered, Clara crossed the hall. Warmth leapt into her arms the moment she lifted the child. "Hush," she whispered to nerves and wail both. The storm rattled the patched window. She sat, tried to rock and stood again. The room felt crowded with imagined eyes. The baby latched, calmed, then flinched when thunder rolled the rafters. "It's only noise," she said, and heard the lie inside it. "I shouldn't be here," she told the dark. "I shouldn't make a cradle inside another woman's name." At the window, lightning showed the yard glazed black with water braided by pale ice. Beyond the pump, the slope fell to the lower pasture where the old calving barn hunched against willow and drift. It looked for a breath, like a room with no listeners. She pressed her mouth to Rose's crown. "We'll go and come back before dawn," she promised to air. She wrapped the child in herself, lifted the latch and stepped into the wet cold that pinched her lungs. Mud grabbed her shoes. Freezing rain needled her face. She ran, slid, ran again, shawl dragging, skirts sucking at her knees. Thunder hammered the ridge. Cottonwoods answered with a dry drum. "I'm not her mother," she sobbed, as if confession could buy peace. "I'm not her mother." She caught a fence post, pushed on and reached the barn. Wind shoved the door with her, then gave up when the wood closed. Dark gathered with weight. Her fingers found the hook and a cold stub of lantern. The first match snapped. The second died in a draught. The third caught and threw a small circle that made hay glow like old gold. Clara set the light in a stall corner and slid down with her back to the timber. The floor had turned to black soup. Cold climbed by inches. She lifted Rose higher so cheek met skin, not wet cloth. You came hungry and I came empty, she whispered. I am doing wrong by both of you. The baby mouthed at the air and protested like a bird. Forgive me, she said, not sure if she meant Eli, Eliza, God, Samuel, or the child whose breath tapped like a small hammer. In the main room, Samuel startled from the chair he had not meant to sleep in. Silence had changed its shape. He looked to the cradle, empty, blanket folded back like a page. The spare door stood ajar. Clara, he called, panic braided into the name. He saw sleet-scarred tracks slicking toward the lower ground, took the lamp, dragged on his coat and ran for the lean-to. Snow was falling now, finishing the argument. Rain had begun, laying sugar over glass. He saddled the roan, let it out and mounted. The horse slid, recovered and found a cautious rhythm. Samuel followed the track by its faint, darker sheen. The lamp pushed a meager island through the storm. Hold, Rose, he said into the wind. Hold, Clara. The lower gate sagged like a tired jaw. He swung it wide and saw the barn roof lift from the white. The door had not been latched. He slid down, tied the reins and pushed inside with his shoulder. The roan waited at the threshold, breathing steam. Clara, he said. And the boards gave his voice back thinner. He raised the lamp. Light found her small against the stall, the child's cry arriving like a thread. He crossed the distance in 3 strides that felt like running while mired, set the lamp on a beam, shrugged out of his coat and dropped to his knees. She flinched, then sagged when she recognized him. I shouldn't have stayed, she said, voice like a broken saw. They were right. I am taking someone's chair. She looked at Rose as if waiting to be judged. I'm not her mother. Samuel wrapped the coat around them both, then cupped it over the child so that the small face glowed in a pocket of breath. He set his palm over Clara's fists until their shaking softened. Listen, he said. You walked through the weather to feed her when there was no mouth but yours between her and winter. You came when this room had only ash. You turned milk into mercy. He drew breath that scraped. You're her mother now. Clara's eyes flooded, not like rain but like thaw, slow, certain, gentling the ground it touched. She bent and kissed Rose's temple as if relearning a word she had once known and feared to say. The cry thinned to a mew. Clara guided the small search to warmth and relief. Rhythm began, pull, swallow, breath. And the barn reordered itself around that music. Samuel slid a straw under their knees and drew them toward the horse's generous flank. The roan stood patient and radiated a heat forgotten until a night like this in boards gave off hay and leather and last summer's dust. I thought leaving would spare you talk, Clara said when the child drifted. I thought I was the trouble. Talk is weather, Samuel answered. It comes, it goes. We brace. We share. He listened for any change in the baby's breath and found only peace. Eli kept lists, she whispered. Hinge pins. Ridge leaks. Little repairs that hold a house. I keep trying to be a repair, not a replacement. But hands learn the shape of a child. They do, he said, plain and clean. He tugged the coat closer and felt 3 heartbeats, learning a pattern that did not ask permission. Wind shouldered the door and failed. Ice slid from the rafters and thumped to the ground. Outside, the creek ran black under a new crust. Inside, the mouth slackened to sleep. Clara let her head find the post. Will you be ashamed, she asked, when the valley names us out loud? I have been ashamed of many things, he said. Fear, delay, my clumsy hands, not this, not the thing that kept her living. They sat until breath and lamp matched tone. At last, he stood, tucked the child into the sling inside his coat and offered Clara his arm. Come home, he said. A word that did not claim morning would grow kind, only that a door would open and a fire would hold. She rose on trembling legs. He steadied her with a hand that had mended wire and still knew how to carry. The lamp swung once, steadying like a quiet heart against the cold on that long night. They stepped into the snow. The roan set himself and waited. Samuel boosted Clara up and passed her the lamp. She cradled Rose and looked back once at the barn where fear had shouted and then fallen quiet. I will stay, she said. Barely more than breath. He mounted and gathered the rein. Together they followed their own returning track. the lamp a moving island while the storm receded into the hills, leaving three figures learning, step by step, what it means to stand against a season. Dawn unstitched the storm, and left the cabin hushed. Samuel tied the rope in the lean-to, checked the latch twice, and guided Clara over the sill. Her shawl dripped, her breath ran rough, yet her hold on Rose was steady, a strength learned at cost. He coaxed flame from coals, set the kettle, and shut the door on the night. Heat moved through the room in small circles. He brewed coffee and wrapped a warmed stone for Clara's feet. Rose sighed, nuzzled, and fell quiet against her collarbone. Sleep will take the shakes away, he said. Clara nodded and sat in the mended chair. He drew a blanket across her knees and let his hand rest a heartbeat on the worn arm, a promise delivered without spectacle. When both slept, Samuel set out the lengths he had saved for repairs and chose different work. He marked a cradle on the boards, then cut, planed and fitted the frame. Shavings curled like pale feathers along his boots. The rhythm steadied breath that had galloped through the dark. By the time light touched the rafters, joints seated true and rails met palm without splinter or cat. Clara woke to the even rasp of the plane. Last night's words came back whole. You're her mother now. Remembering did not bruise. She kissed Rose's brow, crossed to the work and watched without speaking. Samuel lifted aside and flushed, unsure how to stand inside gratitude. She ran her fingertips down the smooth edge and found patience sealed in each pass. Will it rock? She asked. Just enough, he said. He set runners, tested the sway and adjusted a single peg until the motion gentled into a breath. The room seemed to exhale with it. He penciled letters on the headboard, then took up the knife. Ra-U-S-E-H-O-L-T. He carved as if saying a prayer, thin curl by thin curl, pausing where the grain changed course, letting restraint keep meaning clear. When the last line closed, Clara traced the shallow grooves as though reading a blessing she already knew. He oiled the wood until the color warmed like the afternoon. The scent rose, linseed, pine, a memory of summer hay. They set the cradle near the hearth. Clara laid a clean blanket inside, lifted Rose and settled her gently. The child's mouth softened, tiny hands unfurled. A stillness entered that felt full rather than empty, as if the room had finally learned its work. On the table a folded scrap lay under a cup. Clara lifted it and read a single line in compact script. Stay, not as a helper, as her mother. No flourish, no plea, only room made by ink. She did not sit. She held the paper open, gazed at the cradle and allowed tears to rise without apology. Then she stepped to Samuel, set the note back in his palm and let her fingers remain. I will, she said. The words sounded like a door opening from inside. He nodded, voice tight with relief. Thank you, he managed. Work continued as if guided by that scent. He glazed a new pane and sealed the sill. She simmered stew and sweetened coffee for two. He swept shavings and saved the best for kindling. She stitched a pocket in the cradle blanket for a warmed stone. The house shifted in small decisive ways. A peg set true, a latch oiled, a chair positioned for light. Care announced itself without noise. At noon, the sun slid across the headboard and turned the carved name to Bright Creek water. Rose slept through the mallet's quiet taps, as if persuaded that the world intended to be generous. Samuel trimmed the lamp wick. Clara hummed while knitting a square that would become a soft cap. He lifted the fiddle, hesitated, then found a modest tune that did not crowd the child's rest. The notes and the rocking agreed. Afternoon thinned to blue, snow on the sill melted and fell in soft commas. Through the window, cottonwoods kept their patient stance. Samuel knelt and cut a small heart on the underside rail where only a hand lifting the cradle would find it. Clara watched him turn the wood to hide the mark and understood the unboastful vow embedded there. She reached, touched his forearm, and let her palm rest. Neither moved. Warmth traveled skin to skin with the force of language and needed none. I feared I was stealing a place, she said. I feared grief was asking me to mistake hunger for calling. Grief asks for help, he answered, eyes still on the cradle so the words would land where he meant them. Calling is what we choose to do after we answer. Her hand tightened, then this is the right choice, she said, not as an argument but a witness. Rose murmured in sleep as if seconding. They ate in companionable quiet. He poured more coffee, and she set a folded cloth beneath the cup. so heat would not scar the board. She smiled at the small care. He pretended not to notice, then failed and smiled back. Outside, a fox stitched neat prints along the fence. Inside, the lamp widened its ring and made its shadows touch the floor like two halves of one mark. Evening invited ordinary talk. He told her about a spring when the creek swelled and he carried calves to higher ground, one at a time, boots filling with brown water while meadowlarks scolded from wire. She told him of a day when Eli carved a willow whistle and taught her a tune at the ditch at sundown. They did not trade griefs. They let memory behave like timber laid between walls to hold weight without calling attention to itself. Later he banked the coals and tugged the cradle a hand's breadth closer to their chairs, so neither would need to lean to see the child. Clara's palm hovered above Rose, then rested lightly on her chest to count the rise. Samuel watched her hand keep time and felt his own heart fall into step. When she lifted her palm, she left her touch on his sleeve, a vow carried by contact rather than speech. He covered her hand with his and let that be an answer enough. He wrote the line again and tucked it behind a beam, not from need, only to teach the house to remember good words. She slipped the first note into the stitched pocket, near where the warmed stone would go on cold nights. Wind moved along the wall and found no easy way in. The new pane held, the latch whispered instead of clacking. The chair rocked without complaint. Their small adjustments assembled into safety, the way letters become a name. Night settled without argument. Stars lifted over the ridge and made a thin crown the valley could not tarnish. The lamplight sank to honey at the edges and silver on the knife. Rose breathed slow and sure, lashes dark on cheeks pinked by health honestly earned. The cradle's curve looked certain, the carved letters sure, the hidden heart faithful to its secrecy. Samuel leaned back and let his shoulders ease for the first time in months. Clara leaned with him until their sleeves touched from wrist to elbow. They did not speak for a long while. They listened to the fire tell its own story and to the tiny breath that made time move. When at last Clara spoke, her voice carried the steadiness of a field after the weather had passed. "I will teach her the ridge names," she said. "I will show her how to hear a creek before she sees. I will keep the book of small repairs. I will plant apples by the gate," he said. "I will show her where Elk Pass is after the first snow. I will keep oil for every hinge." He paused, then added, "We will bring her through each season as if the seasons themselves were." Clara looked at him and did not look away. "We will," she answered. The word made a home of the space between them. Outside, a faint breeze rearranged the trees. Inside, choice rearranged their lives. The cradle's slow sway matched the lamp's faint hum, a gentle covenant neither of them would break that night. Have you found family in unexpected places? Share your moment below. Morning rose clear after a thin frost. The yard kept every scar the storm had carved. Samuel checked the fence, tested latches, and listened to water slide under the crust, while the barn settled. Clara watched from the step with Rose wrapped close. The cradle by the hearth held a warmed stone and a folded note for later years. By noon hooves sounded in the lane. 2 riders entered the yard while a third, coat buttoned and hat brim stiff, stepped down from a light wagon and looked at the house as if measuring boards for removal. Samuel eased the latch behind him. Clara shifted Rose and stood where he could see her without turning. The man with papers unfolded his bundle. "Outstanding note," he said. "Signed and witnessed. Widow passed, balance carries, we act by order." Samuel kept his gaze on the men and wagon. "My wife died. Winter ruined what luck remained. You will not take this house." The man tapped the page. "Settle or vacate. A deputy waits to record possession once we stand on your porch by law." One rider moved toward the corral to count heads. The other rolled a smoke and watched Samuel like a patient hunter. Samuel stepped forward. "No one crosses that threshold." The smoker's match went out. "You have your figures," he said. "A crop waits for thaw, and calves come before the creek lifts. Take half my yield for 2 seasons. Add what we can spare from wool and eggs. I will sign the terms and deliver by a calendar we can bear." The man sniffed. Half is generous talk when written on air. He tipped his chin toward Clara. "And generous talk lured a replacement inside your door." Samuel shifted to keep his body between strangers and the room where the cradle rocked. "Half," he repeated. "And the debt goes quiet by autumn next. You know this land. You know what a man can bring out of it when steady hands keep the house and a child gives the effort meaning. The riders weighed weather, time and coin. A meadowlark called as if spring could be commanded by song. The tallyman returned and muttered what everyone knew. A forced sale in March brings pennies. A seized teen leaves ground unbroken. An empty house breaks itself before court stamps a claim. The leader tapped his sheets. Half for 2 seasons, he said. With deliveries to the storehouse each second Sabbath. Weights certified by the clerk. A missed date is a breach. We take the first pick of grain and calves. Any shortfall roll. Samuel saw the trap in plain view, pictured the signboard in town and the clerk's hand, then looked at the doorway where Clara stood with Rose, shawl blue as thaw water. We deliver each second Sabbath, he said. Weights written by both hands, signed by witness. If the road is drowned, we haul by sled. If blight comes, you take the yield by valley percentage. The porch remains ours. The man's mouth tightened, but his eyes tallied risk. He flicked his chin at a rider. Fetch merit to witness. The man swung up and pounded off. Silence settled. Samuel waited, feet planted as if his bones had grown there. Clara adjusted Rose and stood still again. A figure that made the threshold look like a vow. Merit came fast. Hat askew, face open with concern. I'll witness, he said. The leader recited terms while a quill scratched. Samuel repeated his conditions until the ink captured them without tricks. Merit's voice made each clause sound like a post set true in thawed ground. When the last line dried, the leader lifted the deed in one more bluff. Default forfeits all. Deliveries honor debt. Samuel answered. This place stands while I stand. He signed. Merit signed. The leader added his name with an irritated flourish, then nodded to his men. Count nothing, he said. Go. The riders turned, relieved to be spared work in the cold. The wagon creaked. Canvas sighed. Hooves rang. Leather popped. The party retreated with the grudging dignity of men who know a ledger prefers patience to drama. Samuel did not move until quiet returned. He folded the copy, slid it into his pocket, and turned to the door. Clara stepped down with Rose, and met him on the packed earth between the sill and the first stone. She placed her palm on his chest, where his breath still ran hard, and held it there. No speech could have said more. He set his hand over hers, closed his fingers gently, and bent until Rose could study his face. The child frowned as if memorizing the shape of safety. Inside, the room welcomed them. Pane snug. Latch tame, cradle sure on its runner. Samuel set the paper under a plate and weighted it with Eliza's cup. Clara ladled stew, handed him a bowl and touched his sleeve in passing with an ease that had arrived with the afternoon. They ate without hurry. Rose slept, pink and certain, a fist pressed against her cheek. The storm inside their bodies ebbed. Later he carried a sack of seed to the corner, and checked the harness for worn stitching, while she stitched a cap small as an apple and tucked it into the cradle pocket beside the note. Evening slanted across the rafters. He lit the lamp and tuned the fifth. The tune he found was simple, fit for hands tired by bargaining and steadied by promise. Clara hummed, voice low, meeting the song in its middle. The light climbed the carved letters and turned the name bright as creek water. They stood at the door before shutting it on the yard. Cottonwoods kept their still watch. The creek lifted its voice. Samuel looked at the hills and thought not of debt, but of Rose, calves and Sabbath waits under a sky that would watch, and say nothing. Clara leaned her shoulder against his and did not move away. Her hand rose again, found his heart, and stayed. We will meet the days, she said. We will meet them, he answered, and felt the words seat like sound timber. Night gathered without threat. He banked the fire and checked the latch by habit. Clara smoothed the blanket and smiled at the small pocket sewn for a stone. Rose stirred, then returned to sleep, breath steady as a metronome. Samuel slipped the signed copy behind a beam where good words live beside careful work. He sat, and she sat, and the quiet between them felt earned. When the lamp's ring narrowed, he reached across and gathered her hand, not to claim or explain, only to thank. She let her fingers fold around his, and held on. When he finally stood, she stood too at last. He kissed Rose's crown, then looked at Clara, and nothing in his face asked for permission that had already been given. The yard took the last prince. The new weight in his pocket felt less like a chain and more like a ledger casing that could be closed line by line while a family learned to stand together. Have you stood up for someone you love? Tell us your sun warmed the ridge and loosened the last beads of frost. 3 springs have taught the house kind sounds. A hinge that whispers, a latch that settles, a cradle stored high yet polished each winter as if memory were furniture. Rose runs ahead with a ribbon at her wrist, 4 years old and fleet. Clara walks more slowly, one hand on the rise beneath her dress, the other steadying the girl when she circles back to show a feather, a stone, a beetle like a living bead of ink. Samuel carries a board wrapped in sackcloth and a small tin of oil, tools in his pocket, a plan in his hands that feels as calm as prayer. They stop where the lane meets the gate. The new post stands true. The crossbeam waits for a name. Samuel oils the board, tests the grain and lifts the knife. Letters bloom as curls fall. Holt and Row Ranch. He shapes each stroke so it reads like a joined path. One line taken together. Rose spells along, careful and proud. Clara smiles in a way that threads past and future without tearing the present. By the fence, a burlap cradle holds a young apple with white buds trembling on thin twigs. A neighbor traded it for help with a stubborn plow, swearing its fruit is pale and fragrant, flesh like snow, sweet enough to make lean months feel merciful. Samuel sets a shovel and opens the earth. Rich loam rises, smelling of rain that has not yet fallen. Rose kneels and pats a worm with one gentle finger. Will it grow? She asks. It is strong, like your mama, he answers, and the words sit like timber. They work without hurry. He widens the hole and scrapes it level. Clara loosens the wrap and spreads the roots like hair combed after a bath. Rose carries clods to a ring she builds with solemn pride. The creek murmurs under willow, freed of its harness of ice. When the sapling stands centered, Samuel stakes it with a willow wand and a strap cut from old harness. Loose enough to sway, firm enough to teach. Water runs from the bucket and washes the ground. He spreads mulch and raises a hand to his back. Clara moves behind and draws a slow circle over the sore muscle, a practiced kindness needing no speech. The sign calls again. He lifts it while Merritt, who has walked over with twine and a joke about charging a witness fee and stew, steadies the far end. When the beam sits square, they tamp earth and step back. Sun catches the new name. Merritt tugs his brim, says it looks right and goes. Windows stand open, letting cinnamon drift from the rolls Clara baked. The cradle waits near the door. Clara runs a thumb over the hidden heart carved years ago and smiles at the thought of small feet stirring where silence once slept. She will need only songs, she says. I will tune the fiddle, Samuel answers. Afternoon draws a clean shadow under the sun. A wagon rattles past and tips a hat without slowing. Debt has dwindled to receipts with both names signed. The clerk now nods instead of smirking. The ranch keeps a modest rhythm. Gates swing, ropes coil, tools hang, seed waits in shade. Samuel checks the straps while Clara counts jars. They eat on the step with plates balanced on their knees. The stew forgives winter. Samuel pours Clara watered coffee and slips a cushion behind her. She lets the help land, then touches his wrist in a silent thank you. Rose declares the tree already taller than the dog. Light grows warm. Buds show white at the seams, as if blossom might risk itself before dark. Clara folds baby shirts the size of a hand and stacks them in the cradle. Samuel finds a tune that begins in winter but refuses to end there, letting it circle the room in widening rain. Rose sways with the serious abandon of children who dance because the floor is a friend. Evening cools. They return outside. Cottonwoods stand like friendly ribs. A calf bawls and is answered with authority. Samuel lifts Rose so she can touch a bud with one careful knuckle. Clara presses a palm to his shoulder, anchoring him to a moment he might otherwise rush past. He lowers the child, then draws Clara closer by the small of her back. They stand without speaking as the sign casts a dark stripe across the lane. They read the name aloud. Holt and Row Ranch. It sounds right, then settles under the ribs as something kept. Samuel thinks of a shawl in a trunk, a note on a storm door, a night in a barn when milk turned mercy, and the steady choosing that made king. Clara thinks of a thin journal of repairs, the morning she stepped into weather, the crib carved with Rose's name, and the day the house learned theirs together. Stars appear while daylight lingers. Samuel pours one last ring of water. Rose yawns, rests against his leg, then rallies. Will it grow? She asks again. He crouches and nods toward the stake and strap. It will. Swaying teaches strength. Roots learn our ground. When the time comes it will bear more than it seems able. She nods as if told a secret about herself, and asks whether bees like white flowers. They do, Clara answers. They come singing. They go in. He latches the door by habit, not fear. She trims the lamp and slides the cradle a hand's breadth from the draft. Rose kisses the rail goodnight as if blessing a bug. Samuel sets the sign template in the trunk with keepsakes, lays a page on top that reads, "Deliveries kept, promises kept," and closes the lid. They sit, fingers linked on the table, listening to peepers lift a silver line from the outside. The sapling stirs and the name at the gate settles into place. Clara leans her head to Samuel's shoulder and speaks the truth without embroidery. I came with grief, but found a home. He kisses her temple and lets silence affirm what more talk might brew. He thinks of rows he will mark when the soil dries, of a day he will hoist his child to shake pale fruit into an apron while bees' braids sound through leaves. She thinks of teaching ridge names and creek voices, of keeping a list of small repairs, of how mercy multiplies when shared as ordinary work. He plays softly until the room feels stitched to the night. Rose sleeps, mouth open. The unborn settles as if comforted by the sound that says, wind, gentle now strokes the pane. The house breathes. Tonight needs nothing grand. A door latched, a fire banked, a name raised, a tree watered, a family choosing the work that keeps meaning alive when weather and rumor tire themselves out. If this story of love and healing moved you, hit like and subscribe to Frontier Hearts for weekly tales of romance and resilience in the Wild West. Share how love found you in the comments.